GDP gains are, after all, pretty small.
Yeah, so I think this is the first in a kind of very important mission of defining what a global Britain means in practice. Now the UK has left the EU, it has an independent trade policy. I think the government's right to see the Australian trade deal as key to that. I mean, it could provide up to something like 900 billion in value over the long run, which is quite substantial. There's a lot of potential areas of trade. We've got to really focus here on agricultural issues. But of course, there's a lot of other chapters in this deal that are a lot less controversial and have a lot of potential. Issues like financial services, getting access for British banks to operate more easily in Australia, for digital trade, and things like privacy. For non-discrimination in public sector contracts, giving opportunities for a lot of British companies to bid for Australian public sector and Australian companies to bid for British public sector. There's going to be some kind of migration arrangement, so easier access for movement between Australia and the UK. There's also the little things. I mean, it's zero tariffs on Scottish whiskey for Australians, or zero tariffs on Australian Tim Tams for Brits. So it's a whole bunch of different benefits across the trade deal. And look, I think there's a bit of a tendency to see trade deals, and because trade deals are often negotiated by lawyers, not that I have any problem with lawyers. Some of my best friends are lawyers, but the way things tend to work in legalistic agreements is that it's a bit of to and fro. It's I want this, you want that. We've got our deadlines, we've got our goals, we've got our things we want to protect and things you want to protect. From an economics point of view, the more we can reduce barriers, everyone benefits. Trade is mutually beneficial. I was going to say that there aren't losers in trade, but for the overall society, overall community, trade both ways is hugely beneficial.
David, what do you think? I mean, we can all agree that free trade is good, and the more of it, the better. And the strange thing here in this situation with Australia is that arguably the EU is a much greater competitive threat. Their producers are a much greater competitive threat to our farmers than a country thousands of miles away with sort of the opposite seasonality. But no one who's resisting the Australia deal seemed to have any problem with the EU deal. Quite the reverse, in fact. So what's going on there?
That's a good start. Look, first of all, I'd say that we already have mostly free trade in the UK, and I think that's not under great threat from the public, and we need to keep it that way. We already don't pay a huge amount of tariffs, and for that reason, I don't think an Australia trade deal is economically particularly significant. I think it's more politically significant than it is economically, because when I look around the world, when we look at the post-Brexit scenario, and we say who are we going to be friends with, and I don't need to go into whole Anglosphere or whatever it is, but who are we going to be friends with? A lot of the countries that are in the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, including Australia, the likes of Singapore, Japan, Chile, people who also fundamentally believe in free trade. And so from that point of view, the idea of doing a trade deal with Australia, it's pretty obvious. So, from that point of view, I just think that it's obvious in general. It comes down to the real specifics, and we don't really know what the real specifics are. But I'm fundamentally of the view that as long as we think there is relatively fair competition with Australia or with the EU or whoever it's with, then fundamentally, it's tariffs are kind of like a 19th century answer, or at best an early 20th century. So, get rid of them all as long as we think there is fair competition. So I'm presuming those people who are not worried about the EU think that competition with the EU is fair, and think that competition with the Australia will not be fair. Now, since they won't have read the trade agreement with the EU, and since nobody's read it with the Australia, because we don't really know what's in it, we can't really judge that. But if the competition is fair, as long as the right stuff has been done to make that happen, then we shouldn't be worrying overly about tariffs. And it's really not going to make too much difference any which way, except it's a good thing. Are our farmers competitors with the EU? It depends on the product. I mean, actually, when we talk about farmers and the threats, I think we're talking about lamb and beef. And I think there's a different conversation also to be had about, are lamb and beef so important to the UK that for our food security or for sentiment of whatever we want to do, we wish to protect them from all foreign competition? I'm not sure we do, but let's have that conversation as well. I suspect that in many other product types of farming, like cereals or whatever, there's not actually a problem at all. So again, you've got to be specific in these things. What are we actually worried about?
Right. I mean, that's a great point, David. I mean, I must say I have reservations about the term fair competition, because I ultimately think consumers should be able to, decide what products they want to buy. But that does highlight very much the question here. There's obviously been a lot of political gossip about who's on which side in cabinet. Is it Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss versus George Eustice and Michael Gove, all of this? And the BBC Today programme characterised this as farmers versus free traders. Now, where do you think the UK position has actually landed on this, in that issue, not so much of tariffs, but of those kinds of standards that are perceived to contribute towards so-called fair competition? Again, referencing the discussion on the BBC this morning, there was a farmer who was saying that it wasn't fair to expect him to compete with Australian beef producers because they use hormone feed treatments to give them a greater productivity. Now, I would expect that actually we won't be changing our laws to allow those kinds of products into our market, and that hormone-fed beef will still be illegal. I think that's wrong, as it happens, but I fully expect that that rule will be maintained and not waived by this agreement. So, David, what do you think about that? Do you foresee any particular changes in our standards that the farmers really should be worried about?
I'm not expecting any changes in the hormone treated beef, certainly not yet. I think that might happen if we have a trade deal with the US. But there's two sides of this ledger. There's whatever the UK government introduces in the future and what we currently have, as well as what we currently have. So, for example, there is an animal welfare bill due to go through the Parliament in this session. We don't really know what's in it, but for example, hypothetically, if it puts lots of requirements on UK farmers that are not also requirements of imports under a preferential trade agreement, then I can imagine that UK farmers could say, well, that's not reasonable. You're putting expectations on us, and you are basically saying our animals have to be fantastically treated, and everybody's going to go and buy them from Australia instead. So I think that's where I say that there is a fair competition issue, because it's not just about consumers. I'm afraid that governments do put in place regulations. Actually, so do supermarkets. There's all manner of regulatory schemes about, and you need to have, in my opinion, and that's where we probably differ, I think you do need to have some pretty clear expectations of what it is that the basis on which you're competing. My expectation is that the UK government isn't going to put terribly high conditions on it. I think that in two areas I'm slightly concerned about that. I'm slightly concerned in terms of antibiotic usage, because I think that's a global problem, and I think that trade has an opportunity to help there, and also in climate change. So what I would actually like to see is measures that encourage trade in climate-friendly ways, and I think there could have been an opportunity here. I suspect that's not going to be in at all. Feels like a missed opportunity, but I suspect what we're going to end up with is no different conditions, and the argument will continue. It will continue when there's the animal welfare bill, and it will sort of continue into the future. I also suspect that even on that basis, the UK-Australia trade deal is not going to, what were those terrible words that Minette Batter said? I suspect on its own, the UK-Australia deal is not turn the UK into the Australian outback. Although that's quite an ironic thing to say, given that that's where the food is coming from that's competing potentially with the UK.
Exactly.
There's also an issue, of course, about other trade agreements as well. But there's something else as well. Sorry, and then I'll stop and give Matthew a chance. Something else as well is I'd expect the UK government, or indeed the farmers, or whoever it is, to be coming out with, okay, well, here is actually the data. If UK farming is about to be ruined, or sheep farming or whatever, okay, let's see the data. Let's have a discussion about that. We do seem to be operating a little bit in a vacuum on this.
Matthew, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I was quite a lot there. Just, I think I completely agree. We do seem to be in a fat-free world. I mean, I'd love to see, what the farmers think is going to be the level of exports that would completely, decimate British agriculture and mean that it's no longer existent. That doesn't seem like a reasonable threat from the Australian industry. Just to start with, first of all, on the standards question, Australian farmers maintain a separate supply chain, which it uses for exports to the EU and the UK, and there is no hormone usage in that supply chain using that cattle. So Australia produces to the UK standards for the UK market, and I don't think there's any prospect of that changing. And if that's the way the UK wants to play it, I don't think Australia's got a huge objection to that. Where Australia does play in the UK market is very much the top end. It's not competing with the kind of average quality supermarket meat that's mostly produced in the UK. It's really at that high end, fine dining kind of level. And it's because it is actually quite expensive to ship meat over from Australia to the UK. At the moment, something like 1,500 tons a year of beef shipped from Australia to the UK. That's a tiny proportion of the over 1 million tons of beef that Brits consume every year. So even if after the deal there is a substantial increase, that's still just going to be, even if it's a 10 times increase, it can be like 15,000 tons of over 1 million tons. Of beef consumed. So you're not talking about huge quantities that I can imagine decimating the market. And it's also going to be on the more expensive side of the market anyway. So perhaps there are some competitive pressures on some top end British beef producers that could come to fruition. But I just can't see a destruction of the overall market. I mean, on the climate change question, I think Australia is wary about putting climate change into trade deals. And you, David, obviously have a view of that in terms of where you think they should lay. But I think Australia is expected to make some quite big commitments on climate change, either at G7 or COP, that no doubt are all part of the kind of same discussions that are being had at the same time. Australia has already made quite substantial reductions in carbon emissions. This is the whole myth of it. Australia has reduced carbon emissions by about 19% on 2005 levels. That's Canada, that's only reduced carbon emissions by 1%, the EU about 10%. Australia is ahead of most of its targets. Where Australia's been criticised, doesn't have the same level of prospective targets in the future, but in terms of its previous achievements and I presume its future commitments, it's not going to be that different to the UK, and I wouldn't be too worried about that. Another element with trade as well is it's assumed that importing, New Zealand lamb is deeply carbon inefficient. There's actually some quite interesting studies, and I'm sure you know this, David, that suggests that actually New Zealand lamb, even after considering all the miles it has to travel, is more efficient than Welsh lamb. And that's because it's so efficiently produced in New Zealand that its carbon footprint is lower overall. So I think it's possible to have more trade in an environmentally friendly way. Also, I mean, Australia has a lot more land to farm, and the UK doesn't, in a sense. So if the UK is farming less land, that actually means more land returned to nature. So if there is a tiny reduction as a result of greater Australian imports, you can say that that's an physical environmental benefit there as well.
Or even, dare I say, build some houses. Because
there
are currently it's quite a distortion, really, isn't it, that farmers are incentivized to hold on to their land that might actually be more efficiently used for other purposes. But I think one thing that's also been quite widely commented on here is that perhaps this dispute or these discussions about the Australian trade deal and the tariffs and the regulatory standards is just a tiny taster of what we can expect as the UK trade agenda progresses. In particular, I'm thinking about a potential deal with the United States. Now, what do you think? I'll come to you, Matthew, on this first. What do you think the government can do to avoid being captured by protectionist interests getting even more hysterical than they already are when it comes to a deal with the United States? And I wonder if it's sort of illuminating in any way that we've seen polling this week recently from the Initiative for Free Trade showing that new Conservative voters in the so-called red wall seats massively, strongly support this FTA with Australia. Does this suggest that actually the Conservative Party needs to recognise that its core support has maybe shifted away from where it was traditionally in landed interests and towards people who perhaps have stronger consumer interests in accessing cheaper and better value imports, and potentially people who might actually really value the ability to go and work in Australia or work in the United States? thinking in particular about how this all might play out in upcoming negotiations.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of apparent concern about the idea that this might set a free trading precedent for the UK. And I think that would be excellent. I think setting a precedent in which you reduce tariffs and you reduce quotas, maintain your standards, and have fair and free competition, something I think is synonymous. Not all would, but I think fair and free competition is synonymous. Is excellent. And in some sense, I think the proof's going to be in the pudding. So you've got the NFU saying, well, the Australia trade deal is going to decimate the industry. Well, let's see if that, as I suspect, will not happen. Maybe we've got this 15-year trade period, transition period. Maybe it'll happen in 15 years' time, but more likely than not, British agriculture can adapt to its new kind of market structure and compete with Australia. The classic case is New Zealand, where after reducing tariffs famously, rather than the industry disappearing, it actually became one of the most innovative and efficient in the world and ended up growing as a proportion of the economy. So it's possible that more competition could actually have benefits for domestic industry. It typically does. That's usually seen as one of the broader benefits to trade. And therefore, we see that all the producers who complain and complain and complain, it becomes the boy who cried wolf, and it doesn't end up playing out. I do think the US deal is much harder. The US has its own domestic protectionist interests, and that's now very prominent across both sides of the aisle in Congress, which ultimately needs to approve any deal. So I don't think it's as easy to get it as free trading a deal with the US. So I can't see the US giving access to British agriculture, and Britain probably won't give access in return. So I don't think you're going to end up with as deep a deal necessarily. I think that would be a shame, but I don't think you're going to end up as deep a deal anyway. And each deal is going to be treated on its own terms.
David, what do you think? Is this hysterical reaction from the farming lobby and others? Is this just a foretaste of what we can expect if negotiations with the US progress?
Yes, I think so. And I think it's a mistake. And I think it reflects several years of a mistake, actually, because in a publication I wrote in 2018, first one after I left the government, I said that if the UK's trade policy ended up being dominated by the old arguments, by which I meant mainly agriculture, it would be a failure. I mean, it is actually hard to believe that in 2021, when agriculture is a tiny fraction of an economy, and tariffs in reality the tariffs we pay aren't that high. So what we're actually talking about is where the food might come from. We're talking, and the conditionality. They're important issues, but they're not fundamental to the economy. We seem to be in the wrong place. I mean, one of the more interesting comments I've been having on social media about the Australia trade deal is that I talk about lamb and beef, and some people say, well, what about lab-grown meat? Might this not all be a completely abstract conversation in 10 or 20 years' time? Why are we not even talking about how we're each going to regulate lab-grown meat? Because this might be trade that in 10, 20 years' time is not happening. And that brings us on to the sort of the bigger question of this, and what I really think is the missed opportunity. If we actually had an agriculture policy, all right, we say we want to protect our sheep farmers, let's say. Now, we might not like it, we might not think that they should be, but if we'd done that, then we don't need to have this argument every single time about sheep farmers or beef farmers or whatever. If we actually vaguely knew, I mean, okay, my take and yours might be slightly different. My take would be if we have a certain set of conditions and then full competition on that, you might not have the same conditions. But I think roughly it's the same sort of idea. Basically, set your policy and then just do it, rather than it. The fear here is that Australia, the fight carries on almost after this. There's a fight going on as to what the conditions are for this. Then there'll be another one about New Zealand. Then it'll be all the worse with the US, because it just is all the worse with the US always. And it just feels like a waste. We're talking about agriculture as trade policy. We're not talking about, I don't know, additive manufacturing, lab-grown meat, artificial intelligence, services. The UK is a services powerhouse. Shouldn't the cabinet be discussing how we're going to make sure that the UK continues to be a services powerhouse in years to come, and whether these trade deals support it? I'm not even sure. I'm being very heretic here. I'm not even sure that free trade agreements are the best thing for the UK to do, because I'm not sure they do a lot for services. Convince me otherwise. They do a lot for services, UK government, and I'll be happy. But if they don't, I think there's actually possibly better things we could do to make sure that we're able to sell our innovative services around the world. But I fear all of that is my sort of idealism. I fear that we are stuck, as Matthew said, it's going to be worse with the US, and even more of a waste with the US. Why are we going to have an argument with the US in which we know we don't fully agree on the US food standards? The US doesn't even fully agree with itself on food standards. California is about to introduce the most stringent animal welfare standards seen anywhere, I think, and they're going to be banning sale of meat from elsewhere in the US. That is a whole issue that is waiting to come to the fore. Honestly, why should we spend our time arguing about that with regard to UK, US, when
Right,
there's so much more better stuff we can discuss?
And we have our own Internal Market Act now as well. That's probably going to test the way food standards and rules work
in the UK as well. Though I don't think Scotland are going to go quite as far as California.
No,
maybe in the future they will.
I think that's right. I mean, David, you won't get any argument from me that free trade agreements are a suboptimal way of pursuing free trade. I would definitely favour a unilateralist approach, although I'm not entirely sure that that's what you were necessarily endorsing there. But can I ask you a technical point, David? Matthew mentioned just there about the possibility that agriculture, or certainly sensitive agricultural products, might not be included in an ultimate deal between the US and the UK. And at one point it was suggested that the Agriculture Minister, George Eustice, was trying to broker a compromise deal here where we would get rid of tariffs on Australian beef and lamb, but we would maintain quotas, and that would just be the permanent solution rather than being phased out. Now, is that even lawful? Or is that in compliance with WTO rules? Because doesn't a free trade agreement have to include substantially all trade? And I know you can, around the edges, carve out certain sensitive products, but I'm not sure carving out the whole agricultural sector or whole important products like beef or lamb would really cut it on that. What do you think?
I think that it gives me an opportunity to mention my favorite, all tradies' favorite WTO dispute case, which said that substantially all could be defined as more than some, but not as much as all, which was perhaps one of the most useless definitions ever. Look, I think we could maintain some quotas, and I think that's the point. I mean, whether or not, lots of people love the idea of free trade, but most countries in agriculture, they have noticed there's one or two things. They're just too politically sensitive to go there. So it's just easier to maintain a quota on one or two products. And I'm sure we could have a UK-Australia deal on that basis. I'm not a big fan of the idea of a 15-year phase-in period. That feels like the current government saying, we know there's going to be a problem and we're going to leave it to a future government to deal with it, which, just if we believe that free trade is going to be good and people should adjust. 15 years, 2-year phase in at most. Yes, we could have one or two quotas, but I think we're only talking about a handful of lines. The other thing to say about this is that there's an Australia specific element to this in lamb, which is rarely picked up in the debate, which is that if you look at the WTO quotas between Australia and New Zealand, this was for the EU, and then they're going to be split, obviously, as part of Brexit. New Zealand has something like 5 times the WTO quota for sheep meat than Australia, which on any basis is not an entirely fair split, given they produce roughly the same. Now, if I'm Australia, obviously I want to gain access. New Zealand doesn't, in fact, fill all of that quota, or hasn't in many years. So it's not entirely clear that Australia necessarily would either. There's a whole bunch of other stuff about how much of this is actually going to be bought. 3/4 of Australia's meat is sold to Asia at the moment, and a big chunk of the rest goes to North America. But from Australia's point of view, you're looking at these figures and going, this isn't fair. We should have the same quotas as New Zealand. So no blame to Australia for trying this on. I think that this is just up to the UK government to have a policy, and a policy of we'll have a policy in 15 years' time seems completely ridiculous. I think that we have a policy now and we say, all right, there's one or two things we protect, or we say there's nothing we protect. We say these are the conditions or these are not the conditions, and then we just do it. It feels like prolonging the agony this way.
So looking forward a bit, Matthew, I'll come to you first on this question. What do you think the learnings are for the Department of International Trade that they potentially might want to do things differently on the next round? How are they going to head off these kinds of protectionist voices in future trade negotiations, or indeed in future unilateral liberalizations? How are we going to persuade Minette Batters and others to be perhaps a bit more reasonable in this context?
Well, in some respect, I think the backlash from the farmers seems kind of inevitable, and I don't know the government can do much to stop that. In a sense, it's really a sectional interest making a claim, and it's the government's role to think about the broader consumer good. I think you're right, David, that ultimately this will be decided by what Australian producers want to produce and where they want to sell and where they can get the most bang for their buck. And it's often mostly in Asia these days. You're not going to see a flood into the UK. And then when there is more availability in the UK, it's up to consumers to decide what they want to purchase. I think that's the first and foremost principle. If consumers really love Australian beef and they decide that that's all they want to eat and everyone goes crazy for it, I don't think you should do anything to stop that. I think it would be wrong for the government to stop that. In terms of broader learnings, what I'd like to see is a bit more focus from the government kind of talking about particularly the export opportunities. Now, I know that's kind of a bit mercantilist, but it seems like the Australian agriculture industry or the New Zealand agriculture industry take a very different approach to trade as lobby groups. They are all for free trade, and that's because they see themselves as global players, as people who are able to do something substantial on the world stage, really take a huge advantage of opportunities, not, as I was saying earlier, not even necessarily in Europe, but across Asia, where there's these big growth markets, rising middle class, a huge want to consume meat, and particularly high quality foreign meat. And that creates a lot of substantial opportunities for the British agriculture industry. And that's something through the Australia trade deal, it's a good kind of entry ticket to get Australia's support to join the TPP, the kind of broader Pacific Rim trade deal with 11 nations, places like Mexico and Japan. Obviously there's already a trade deal with Japan, but a kind of additional access to markets, and think about what is the potential of British branded beef and lamb in Asia. That I think there'd be quite a lot. I think there'd be a lot of want and a lot of perception that is a high quality product that's worth buying. And if we can have a debate which says, well, yes, you might be competing with Australian lamb and beef, but also you've got these opportunities to compete with Australia in across Asia and in other places as well. That it's not just kind of lose for the industry, but there are also opportunities created by trade if you're willing to take advantage of them as an industry, and making that point to the industry that you shouldn't just see your first and foremost instinct as protectionist, but you should try to rethink about what kind of global opportunities you have and where you sit in a global Britain.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the ironies actually of the NFU position here, is that they've been violently opposed to opening up our market, but urging the minister and the team on to secure tariff-free trade for our own exports. So that there's a little bit of an irony there. But David, you've been quite critical, I think, in the past about the government making big claims about trade opportunities without really perhaps being ready to handle negotiations. And we've obviously this past week or so, we've seen the rubber really hit the road. What do you think could have been done differently, and what improvements, again, I'll ask you, what improvements could DIT make now for the next lot?
Well, I don't think, and it's sort of an extension of what Matthew said, I don't think we've got to this point where we expect an Australia trade deal to be announced in 3 weeks, I think it is, the G7 summit. And I don't think that DIT or the government as a whole have given us anything to be particularly excited about from the UK government. When they talk about what the UK might gain, they say things like free data. Well, I know we want free flow of data, but it's not as if actually there's been a problem on that score with Australia. Or they talk about 7 pence of a bottle of wine. Well, it's not that interesting. I'm sure there is more that we can be doing. And I don't know, I have this sense that that DIT's not been trying hard enough to really push at the margins of what a trade deal can do. Okay, I was saying I'm not sure about trade deals, but if we're going to go with the trade deal front, what's the furthest we can go in services or in regulatory cooperation? Because they haven't done a lot in those areas before. How far can we go with Australia or with New Zealand, two of the kind of countries who we should be able to persuade to do something? So I guess it's about that missed opportunity, but it's also about that sort of making it interesting. It's almost like global Britain is going to be exciting because we have a deal with Australia, not because of what's in it. And I think that's what I would dearly like to see, something more interesting. I had felt that the UK was not going to be restricted like the EU or the US was by old ways of thinking on trade deals. So we know the US really wants to get their agriculture into other countries when they do trade deals. We know the EU needs their geographical indications. And I thought, well, the UK doesn't really need either of those things. So what's the UK's kind of interesting thing that we could do? And it doesn't seem we've actually got it. And I'd really like to find that thing, so that when people say, oh, but agriculture is a real problem, we could say, yeah, but no country has ever done what we do with services. Just an example on services. It's something I've not had time to fully scope out, but I keep having this idea. We have this idea with tariffs. You reduce the tariffs, then you can sell goods without tariffs. What's the services equivalent? Can we just say that UK service providers who are duly regulated in the UK, or Australian service providers, can freely provide services in the other place without any hitches?
Like passporting, basically.
Sorry?
Like passporting.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can, but shouldn't we try that sort of thing with Australia or New Zealand?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a great point. Well, it sounds like your message from both of you is that we should just be being a bit more ambitious, really, which I would certainly agree with. So this has been really fascinating, and I'd love to have you both back on to talk a bit more, perhaps, about the services and the data side and some of those more ambitious things that future trade agreements could be looking at. But in the meantime, for now, thank you both, and thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for joining us this afternoon. For more details of our online content and to stay updated on all of our activity, please visit our website, iea.org.uk. Check out our YouTube channel, IEA London, and our podcasts on Podbean and all good podcast channels. You can now support the IEA's digital output on Patreon, where we have set up a membership platform that allows members to donate solely towards our digital work. As an online patron, you will have access to exclusive IEA perks, priority access to our content, and much more. If you'd like to directly help the IEA continue producing stimulating educational online content, please do go over to patreon.com/IEA London. So thanks again for watching or listening, and we hope you will join us again soon.